Yes, Scripture answers clearly. You will know them. Around AD 30 on a mountain, 3 disciples watched 2 men dead for centuries. Moses since roughly 1400 BC, Elijah since 849 BC, appear fully recognizable beside Jesus. A rich man in torment named Abraham by sight. A king in 1000 BC planned to join a son he'd lost, not a stranger. Like a seed raised as a flower, same life, now complete. So, will we truly recognize the people we loved? Picture the moment. You step into eternity, and across the crowd stands someone you buried years ago. A parent, a spouse, a child. Do you know them, or does death dissolve everything that made them who they were? Most people assume the safer answer. Heaven erases the particulars, and we become interchangeable souls. Undefined light, no accent, no scar you used to trace with your thumb. That fear is not irrational. Plenty of cultures picture death as dissolution, a drop returning to the ocean, all boundaries erased. If that picture were true, love would not survive death either, because love needs 2 distinct people to hold it, not one indistinct glow. The Bible was written into a world full of competing pictures, and it had every opportunity to teach dissolution. Instead, every time it lifts the curtain on the afterlife, it shows individuals, not a merged light, and makes that case early, on a mountaintop, with 3 named witnesses who recorded what they saw. That mountaintop moment is Matthew 17, verses 1 through 8. 6 days earlier, at Caesarea Philippi, Peter had confessed Jesus as the Christ. This is the same 3 who would later watch him agonize in Gethsemane. Peter, James, and John climb with Jesus, and his appearance changes before them. His face shines like the sun. His clothes turn white as light. Then 2 other figures appear beside him, and the disciples do not need a name tag. This is Moses, dead since roughly 1406 BC, and Elijah, swept up in a whirlwind around 849 BC. Peter, moved and half panicked, offers to build 3 shelters. One for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Nobody explains who these men are. Nobody has to. A bright cloud covers them. A voice speaks from it, and the disciples fall face down in terror until Jesus touches them and says, "Rise, have no fear." Centuries after their deaths, Moses and Elijah were still recognized on sight without a moment's hesitation. That single detail collapses the anonymous soul theory. If identity dissolved after death, Peter would have seen 2 glowing strangers, not 2 named prophets in conversation with Jesus. Instead, he sees continuity, a lawgiver and a prophet who lived centuries apart, both still unmistakably themselves, now standing in glorified form beside the Messiah they had spent their lives pointing toward. That pointing toward makes the next confrontation almost inevitable. Not everyone in Jesus' time accepted resurrection. The Sadducees rejected it outright, and in Matthew 22, verses 23 through 33, tried to trap him with a question. A woman is married in turn to 7 brothers, each dying before her, and she dies last of all. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Jesus does not dodge or soften it. "You are wrong," he tells them, "because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God." He answers by quoting Exodus 3:6, where God calls himself the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, then adds the line that undercuts their argument. God is not God of the dead, but of the living. The Sadducees held real power. They controlled the temple priesthood and the Sanhedrin, and this exchange took place in the temple courts during the final week before the crucifixion, likely the Tuesday we now call Passion Week. That answer does something specific. Jesus does not argue for a vague afterlife where spirits float free of biography. He roots the whole argument in three named men, each still bound to God's covenant language centuries after their deaths. Abraham is still Abraham to God. Isaac is still Isaac. Jacob is still Jacob. This is not abstract theology floating above ordinary life. If God still calls himself the God of Abraham, then whatever relationship he holds with the people you have lost has not lapsed. The naming is possessive and present tense, not past tense. Matthew records the crowd astonished at his teaching. Jesus had just turned a legal trap into proof of personal, ongoing identity. If two named prophets and three named patriarchs sound like special cases, the next scene removes that excuse entirely. Luke 16, verses 19 through 31, tells of a poor man named Lazarus, covered in sores, laid daily at the gate of a rich man who ignored him. The rich man is never named in the text, but Lazarus is. The only character in any of Jesus' parables given a personal name, meaning God has helped. Both men die. Lazarus is carried by angels to Abraham's side. The rich man is buried, and in torment lifts his eyes and sees Lazarus far off with Abraham. He does not call out to a generic deity or an undefined light. He calls out to Father Abraham by name without hesitation and asks him to send Lazarus with a drop of water to cool his tongue. Some readers wave this away as just a parable, not a literal window into judgment. Even granting that reading, the detail still counts. A parable only works if its inner logic makes sense to the people hearing it. Jesus builds this one on the assumption that dead people recognize each other by name across millennia. If that assumption were false, the parable would confuse its audience rather than persuade them. It persuades because everyone listening already believed identity survives death. That shared belief gets more striking once you consider the distance involved. Abraham lived around 2000 BC. This rich man dies roughly 2,000 years later, and yet he recognizes Abraham on sight and carries on a full conversation with him. A great chasm separates them, verse 26 says. They cannot cross to reach each other, but the chasm does not erase recognition. It blocks travel, not identity. The rich man even asks Abraham to warn his 5 living brothers, and Abraham answers him by name. Even in judgment, even across 2 millennia, people still know exactly who they are looking at. Three scenes, 3 eras, and in every one the dead are known by name rather than dissolved into anonymity. If that pattern is real, it should show up in ordinary grief too, not just in visions and parables about the afterlife. It does. In one of the most human passages in the Old Testament, centuries before Jesus climbed that mountain. Like a seed that keeps its identity while buried underground, this pattern of recognition holds long before resurrection is formally taught as doctrine. That human passage is 2 Samuel 12, verses 15 through 23. David's infant son by Bathsheba falls sick, and David fasts and lies on the ground all night, refusing food while the elders try to raise him up. The prophet Nathan had confronted David only months earlier over the affair with Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite. The boy is never named in the text, dying before the 8th day, when Israelite sons were normally circumcised and named. On the 7th day, the child dies, and his servants are afraid to tell him, worried he might harm himself in grief. But when David notices them whispering and learns the child is dead, he gets up, washes, changes his clothes, worships, and eats. When his servants ask why, stunned, he says something that only makes sense if death does not erase relationship. I shall go to him, he shall not return to me. He is not describing extinction, but a reunion he fully expects to have. David does not say he will forget his son or meet an unrecognizable spirit somewhere out past the stars. He says he will go to him, the specific child he had wept and fasted for. A grieving father, 1,000 years before Christ, already assumes what the Transfiguration will later put on public display. Death changes location, not identity. That same assumption sits even deeper in the Bible's own timeline. Job, widely considered among the oldest books in Scripture, set in the patriarchal era, makes one of the boldest personal identity claims in the text. While sitting in ashes, stripped of his children, his wealth, and his health. Scholars typically date its setting to somewhere between 2100 and 1800 BC, before the law of Moses existed. Job's losses were itemized in the opening chapter: 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and 10 children, all in a single day. In Job 19, verses 25 through 27, he says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, in my flesh I shall see God. My own eyes shall behold him, and not another." Not a description of some other being seeing God on his behalf. Job insists it will be him. His own eyes, his own flesh, his own redemption. That own eyes, own flesh claim, stacked next to Moses and Elijah, reveals a shape spanning the whole Hebrew Bible. Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets. Job sits among the writings, wrestling with wisdom itself. 3 separate strands of Scripture, centuries apart, all assume the same thing. The person who dies is still the person who is raised. That is not a coincidence one clever writer could engineer. It is a conviction woven into the whole library. That library-wide conviction shows up in Job's own grammar, too. Notice the pronouns doing the heavy lifting. I, my flesh, my own eyes. Job is not hedging towards some diffuse spiritual awareness he cannot quite name. He is staking a claim to bodily, personal, first-person continuity from what may be the oldest layer of the Bible we have. The idea that you remain you after death is not a late theological add-on invented centuries later to comfort mourners. It is present at the root, as old as the text itself. That rootedness invites an obvious, mechanical objection. How does a body that has decayed or burned or been lost at sea for centuries become anything at all? Paul takes that question head-on around AD 55, writing from Ephesus to a congregation with genuine doubts about resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 35 through 44, he answers with an image every farmer in his audience would have understood: a seed. Ephesus at the time was a Roman port city of perhaps 250,000 people, and Paul had spent close to 3 years teaching there, according to Acts 19 and 20, before this letter went out. What you sow is not the body that is to be, Paul writes. You sow a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain, and God gives it a body as he has chosen. A seed goes into the ground looking nothing like what comes out of it. Nobody plants a seed expecting to dig up an identical seed later. They expect a plant. Same life, transformed form. Paul pushes the contrast further. Sown perishable, raised imperishable. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. He calls the buried version a natural body and the raised version a spiritual body, but the life inside stays continuous. The wheat isn't swapped for different wheat. It's upgraded wheat. Paul is not finished. He keeps the pronouns personal. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 through 53, he writes, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. Read that sentence again and notice what it does not say. It does not say you will be replaced by someone else. It says we will be changed. That single word carries more weight than a chapter of abstract argument. It rules out both extremes people fear, that death ends you completely or remakes you into someone else entirely. The seed language explains the mechanism. The pronouns confirm who survives it. The same we that fell asleep is the we that wakes up changed. Put the seed and the pronoun together, and the picture sharpens. Change the form, keep the life, keep the we. That is exactly what was already on display a few thousand years earlier on that mountain, and it is worth returning to now. The sharpest single proof in the whole case. Matthew 17, verses 3 and 4, describe it plainly. Behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Do the math on the gap. Roughly 1,430 years had passed since Moses died on Mount Nebo. Roughly 880 years had passed since Elijah was taken up in his whirlwind of fire. These are not recently deceased relatives with fresh photographs still circulating in a family album. These are figures from ancient textbook history, and Peter names both without anyone telling him who they are. A glorified body, transformed by more than a millennium in God's own presence, is still identifiable enough that an uneducated Galilean fisherman recognizes it instantly. That is not a minor detail tucked into a larger story. It is the whole argument, staged as a live demonstration, with 3 eyewitnesses and their names attached to the record. Think about what that implies for the people you have lost, not just for Moses and Elijah. Whatever body they are raised in, whatever glory changes them, the thread connecting who they were to who they will be does not snap. You would know them the same way Peter knew 2 prophets he had never met before that day. None of that answers the question that makes people genuinely uneasy, and it deserves a straight answer. If we still recognize and remember the people we loved, how can heaven contain no sorrow? Grief and memory usually travel together. Revelation 21:4, written around AD 95 by John on Patmos, promises that God himself will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death, mourning, crying, and pain are named as the things that pass away. Read that verse again and notice what is missing from the list. Memory is not on it. The text removes death, mourning, crying, and pain. The wounds, not the relationships that made those wounds possible. Scripture promises the tears go. It never promises the people who caused those tears are erased with them, as if grief and love shared one exit. Test that against your own life. The deepest ache in grief is never about memory itself. Nobody wishes they could forget a person they loved just to stop hurting. The ache is about absence, about a chair that stays empty, about a phone that never rings again. Fix the absence, and the same memories that once hurt become the things that make reunion sweet instead of painful. That distinction resolves the whole tension once you see how Paul frames grief. Writing around AD 51, roughly 2 decades after the resurrection, he tells the Thessalonians in chapter 4, verse 13, that they should not grieve as others do who have no hope. Paul does not tell grieving believers to stop remembering the dead, nor does he ask them to stop feeling the loss. He tells them their grief takes a different shape because they have hope. And the content of that hope, spelled out a few verses later, is reunion, seeing those people again, not forgetting they ever existed. That is the mechanism behind No More Tears. Grief exists because of separation and uncertainty, not because memory itself is the problem. Remove the separation, replace the uncertainty with a promised reunion, and grief has nothing left to feed on. You do not need amnesia to end sorrow. You need your loved one back in the room. That need for the room, not just the memory, is exactly what Jesus promises next. A flower does not bloom to stand alone. It blooms in a garden built for it. Jesus makes that reunion the explicit point of heaven, and he says it on the worst night of his friends' lives, hours before his own death. In John 14, verses 2 and 3, during the upper room discourse around AD 30 to 33, he tells his grieving disciples, "I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Notice whom he says this to. Not a crowd of strangers, but Peter, John, and the others by name, men he had eaten with for 3 years. Heaven, in his own words, is not described as a location upgrade, a bigger city with better weather. It is described as a personal reunion he is deliberately preparing for the people he loves. Put every scene back on the table at once. Moses and Elijah, known by sight after 1,000 years. The rich man naming Abraham across 2 millennia without a moment's hesitation. David, certain he was going to a specific child rather than into the dark. Job, staking his own eyes and his own flesh on seeing God in person. Paul's seed, buried as one thing and raised as the same life in a stronger form. The spiritual body of 1 Corinthians 15:44, raised in power. Every one of those threads, from a mountain, a parable, a nursery, an ancient sufferer, and a letter from Ephesus, points the same direction. Identity is confirmed, not erased. That is the flower the seed was always going to become. Same life, fully grown, fully known. You will count emu, will be count own. Heaven, on this evidence, was never going to be a room full of strangers. So here's the question worth sitting with. If remembering the people we lost is part of what makes heaven, heaven, does that make grief now a kind of preview of the joy later? Or does it make the waiting harder, not easier? Tell me which side you land on in the comments. No wrong answer here. And if this walked you somewhere you didn't expect, subscribe. There is more of this ahead.